Hey, what's up, everybody? It's Nasir Evans, host of the Central Pro Podcast. Thank you for joining me. And today on the show, I have a great story. Behind me is the Jefferson Archives. And in that archive are the actual keys to a mystery, a dark past, and a piece of legislation that we use to this day. I'm going to tell you about it. Give me a second. Okay. So here's how the story goes. So, back in the late 1800s, after the Civil War and things like that, African Americans or blacks weren't able to be buried in places like the Arlington Cemetery, like the National Arlington Cemetery, where our heroes get buried. So back in that time, they had to be buried in a cemetery in their community, somewhere in their community. So here in Philadelphia, not here on this sprawling center, but not too far from here, was a cemetery called Lebanon. Now, Lebanon was a cemetery for prominent blacks. Again, those who couldn't be buried in the cemeteries of their white counterparts. So, for a long time, residents and the families of some of the people that were buried in Lebanon in the cemetery were starting to find out that their loved ones' graves were being desecrated. So they would come back a few months later to pay respects, and there would be no one at the grave. There would be nothing in the grave but a hole. So over time, they called the police, but back in this time, police really weren't, maybe not much has changed in some respects, but at that time, blacks really couldn't get any leeway with police. No matter what they said or how they went about it, the police would just shoot them off. They weren't able to get any help. So what they did is they went to the newspapers. So they started telling newspapers that their Civil War veterans, their bodies were missing out of the cemetery. That's crazy, right? So over time, they noticed that there were hundreds. Over the years, there were thousands of bodies missing from the Lebanon Cemetery, a prominent black cemetery. So some of these Civil War veterans, some of their bodies were taken because at that time, doctors and people who did surgery, doctors and people who did surgery, surgeons, they needed cadavers and they weren't readily available, so they would steal them from the cemeteries. So again, the residents, the people of the community, they went to the newspaper. The newspaper thought the story was amazing. They couldn't believe it. And they couldn't believe bodies were being desecrated at that scale. So they came down to find out what was going on. So they got together, the community members and the reporters, and they did a stakeout. Yeah, they did a stakeout. So they brought their knives, they brought their shotguns, they brought their candles and their cans of beans, I guess, or whatever at that time. And they waited to see what would happen. As they were there that night, eventually the grave robbers came, or the body snatchers came. So when they came and they started digging up the grave, the residents jumped out with the reporter, pulled a shotgun on him, and asked him, "What are you doing?" So they surrendered with no problem. They went willingly. So when they were questioned by the police, they said, "This is what we do. We rob graves for a living. We go all around different states, different cities, different towns, and we rob graves." So they say, "Well, what do you do with all these bodies?" He said, "Well, it's easy. We just give it to the doctors. We turn them to the doctors." So he's like, "What doctors? Like, what are you talking about?" So the guy pulls out a pair of keys, a literal set of keys, right? So he says, "Dr. Forbes told us to come get these bodies." And they're like, "Dr. Forbes?" Dr. Forbes was a prominent doctor in Pennsylvania and Philadelphia at that time. I mean, he was big, probably like the Fauci of Philadelphia at that time. So everybody knew this guy. Eventually, they arrest Dr. Forbes. But Dr. Forbes is a prominent man, and you can't stick bad charges to a prominent man. Some of that is still true today. So anyway, when he went to court, he actually won the case. He won the case. So what was his argument? Dr. Forbes said, listen, you can't arrest me for this. You can't charge me for this. He said, how do you expect me to get bodies? How do you expect us to study if we don't have any cadavers to use? Right? So they said, you're right. They're right. So instead of getting charged and put in jail for desecrating hundreds of bodies in cemeteries, the great Dr. Forbes went to legislators. He had legislation put in so that anytime there were hospitals, so anytime there were missing people or people who weren't claimed when they died in a hospital or in a psych ward or anything like that, any unclaimed body will automatically go to the medical community so they could use them for cadavers. So that is on the books today, to this very day, and that was probably